Do I have your attention? You may have your seat unless, of course, you're taller than I am. If you're not taller than me, if you're taller than me, you may remain standing, but otherwise, please take your seats. I'd also encourage everybody to sort of converge in the middle so that we can have an easier discussion. Let's just move to the middle if we can so that we can have better interaction. If you're standing at the back, we're about to start the session. Please take your seats. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. I'll give you about 10 more seconds before we start. Please take your seats. My name is Alan Kasujja. I am a senior journalist, lead presenter on the BBC World Service. My podcast is called Africa Daily. You must subscribe to that podcast if you haven't yet. It will teach you many things about the continent. And I am going to be your moderator today. It's a real honor to be here, and thank you very much for taking the time to be here today. We appreciate it very much. Wherever you're from, thank you, welcome, karibu. I don't know what the rest of the words will be, but as we go along, hopefully, we'll pick them up. Akwaba, oh, how could I forget that one? And it's good to have all of you here. Now, to get the ball rolling, and remember this discussion is very pertinent, it's important for these times. We are trying to trade better as an African continent. We have a power panel. We have some of the best voices, probably the most influential people you'll come across anywhere on the continent to help us understand what's happening on the continent and what is going to facilitate better trade on the continent. Where are the opportunities? Where is the money going to come from? Dr. Oramah is here, so you know where the money is going to come from. What is the policy situation? What do the business people think? That's the sort of engagement we are going to have. The audience is very important in part of is going to be an important part of this discussion. So brace yourselves with those questions. The topic: trade and investment. How can Africa be more competitive in a global context? Wait until you hear what Dr. Oramah has to say about globalization. Very interesting thinking there. To get us started, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to join me in welcoming one of our hosts, an important member of the leadership of this country, the Minister of Trade, Crafts and Promotion of SMEs, and that is the Honorable Suleiman Diarasuba. Let's give him a round of applause as he comes up to speak to us.
Bien, merci. Mesdames et messieurs les ministres, monsieur le représentant monsieur le président de la Banque africaine de développement, mesdames et messieurs les membres du corps diplomatique, mesdames et messieurs les partenaires techniques et financiers, Dr. Benedict Okey, President and Chairman of the Board of Directors of African and Export Bank, chers panélistes, mesdames et messieurs du secteur privé, monsieur le modérateur, chers amis des médias, distingués invités, mesdames et messieurs, c'est un réel plaisir pour moi de prendre la parole ce matin à l'occasion de l'ouverture de cette importante session plénière de l'AIF portant sur le thème « Comment l'Afrique peut être plus compétitive dans un contexte de mondialisation » organisé en marge du Forum pour l'investissement en Afrique par le groupe de la Banque africaine de développement. Je voudrais, à l'entame de mon propos, saluer Dr. Akiwumi Adesina, le président de la Banque africaine de développement, et lui exprimer notre reconnaissance pour toutes les actions menées par la BAD pour appuyer le développement de l'Afrique. Le présent forum destiné à la réflexion sur les stratégies de renforcement de la compétitivité des économies africaines dans un contexte mondial marqué par la concurrence très rude et la rigueur des marchés internationaux en est la parfaite illustration. Je voudrais en tout cas saluer tous nos éminents panélistes et tous les représentants du secteur privé et les partenaires techniques et financiers présents à cette session. Distingués invités, mesdames et messieurs, la cérémonie qui nous rassemble ce jour revêt une grande importance, en ce sens qu'elle porte sur une thématique d'actualité pour l'Afrique, à savoir le renforcement des investissements dans le domaine du commerce et l'industrie pour une Afrique plus compétitive dans un contexte de mondialisation. Comme vous savez, notre continent se positionne comme la région la plus rentable au monde, selon un rapport de la CNUSED, car elle enregistre le taux le plus élevé de rendement des investissements directs étrangers. Le taux de croissance de l'Afrique est estimé à 4,1% en 2021 selon la BAD, et les perspectives de croissance paraissent des plus intéressantes au monde malgré une décélération de la croissance en 2022 projetée à 3,3%, avec au moins 6 pays africains des 12 à plus forte croissance sur la planète, à savoir l'Éthiopie, la Côte d'Ivoire, le Mozambique, la Tanzanie, la République démocratique du Congo et le Rwanda. Grâce à l'exportation des produits agricoles non transformés, le cacao, le café, l'anacarde, le coton et le thé, etc., et de matières premières issues des secteurs extractifs, notamment le pétrole et les minéraux, notre continent enregistre depuis plus de deux décennies de bonnes performances économiques qui n'ont cependant pas entraîné de façon substantielle la diversification économique et la création d'emplois nécessaires à l'inclusion économique des populations. Faut-il le rappeler, notre continent présente de nombreux atouts susceptibles d'intéresser les investisseurs privés. Ces atouts sont entre autres la disponibilité des ressources et matières premières stratégiques. Selon la Banque africaine de développement, l'Afrique détient entre 60 et 65% des terres arables au monde, 8% des réserves prouvées de pétrole, 7% des réserves de gaz, 30% des réserves des minières indispensables à l'économie mondiale, à savoir la platine, le diamant, le chrome, manganèse, nickel, uranium, etc. De plus, notre continent est leader mondial dans la production de plusieurs matières premières agricoles, notamment le cacao, avec en pole position la Côte d'Ivoire avec 2 200 000 tonnes, le café, le thé, la noix de cajou, encore une fois avec la Côte d'Ivoire avec plus de 1 million de tonnes, le coton, les épices, le tabac et les huiles essentielles. Par ailleurs, les besoins importants sont exprimés dans les secteurs comme la banque, les télécommunications et les infrastructures. Ceux-ci sont classés parmi les moteurs de la croissance en Afrique, où de nombreuses entreprises mondiales y ont investi car ayant des avantages comparatifs. Selon la CNUSED, l'Afrique a enregistré le taux de rendement des investissements directs étrangers le plus élevé, soit 14%, contre un taux de 7,1% à l'échelle mondiale et 9,1% en Asie, 8,9% dans la région Amérique latine et Caraïbes. Notre continent se présente littéralement comme la région, comme je l'ai indiqué, la plus rentable au monde. Distingués invités, mesdames et messieurs, s'agissant des marchés, les pays africains ont mis en place des politiques visant à améliorer l'accès aux marchés extérieurs, ce qui s'est traduit par la création de la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine et des accords d'intégration de partenariat économique avec d'autres régions du monde. En effet, le marché unique africain de 1,3 milliard de consommateurs officiellement en vigueur depuis le 1er janvier 2021 représente une opportunité pour les entreprises et les économies car il va contribuer de façon significative à capter des capitaux nationaux et étrangers et à promouvoir le partage d'informations pour renforcer leurs performances et l'effort d'industrialisation des pays. Le respect des normes de qualité des produits africains que ce nouveau marché exige doit contribuer à l'amélioration de la compétitivité de nos économies, de nos entreprises ainsi que des produits africains. Par ailleurs, les coûts des facteurs relativement bas sont des atouts pour la réalisation d'investissements nouveaux dans des secteurs stratégiques tels que l'énergie pour permettre aux industries locales de fonctionner à l'optimum de leurs capacités. Mesdames et messieurs, le thème de ce forum, Investir durablement pour renforcer la résilience économique, sonne comme un appel aux États africains à prendre des mesures idoines pour renforcer leurs investissements productifs dans tous les secteurs économiques du continent et à proposer des pistes de solutions pour améliorer la résilience et la capacité d'adaptation des entreprises sur le continent africain et tirer pleinement profit des opportunités du commerce mondial. Le panel qui nous réunit ce jour autour du thème « Commerce et industrie », comment l'Afrique peut-elle être plus compétitive dans un contexte de mondialisation vise à engager les acteurs du secteur public et privé, les partenaires techniques et financiers et les promoteurs de projets autour de la problématique du renforcement des investissements de l'industrialisation et le commerce en vue de favoriser l'intégration du continent dans les chaînes de valeur mondiales. Pour relever le défi de l'industrialisation et du développement du commerce sur le continent, les États africains devront engager des réformes importantes pour changer le paradigme actuel et permettre au continent africain d'être plus compétitif et offensif afin de contribuer de façon significative au commerce mondial. Pour ce faire, nous devons pouvoir relever les défis importants, notamment en termes de renforcement des infrastructures viables, de la levée des barrières tarifaires et non tarifaires, de la formation de la jeunesse, du renforcement de l'amélioration de l'environnement des affaires, du renforcement de l'accès au financement des initiatives privées, de l'amélioration de la gouvernance et de la lutte contre la corruption. En outre, il convient de relever que le développement de la compétitivité des économies africaines dans un contexte de mondialisation ne peut se faire sans le secteur privé, qui demeure un levier essentiel pour accélérer la diversification économique grâce à l'innovation dans des domaines à fort potentiel tels que l'agriculture, l'agro-industrie, la santé, l'éducation, l'infrastructure et l'énergie. C'est pourquoi des réformes et mesures importantes sont à intégrer dans les stratégies de développement de l'industrie et du commerce pour une Afrique plus forte, compétitive et dynamique. Il s'agit notamment de la mobilisation de l'épargne, le renforcement de la stabilité macroéconomique, le développement des activités du digital, du numérique, le renforcement des droits de propriété intellectuelle et le développement de l'innovation. Ces réformes doivent contribuer à accélérer l'investissement, notamment dans le développement des chaînes des valeurs, des produits vivriers également pour assurer la souveraineté alimentaire de l'Afrique. Ce forum s'inscrit parfaitement donc dans la vision de son Excellence, M. le Président Alassane Ouattara, Président de la République de Côte d'Ivoire, qui est d'accélérer la transformation structurelle de l'économie ivoirienne par l'industrialisation et le développement des grappes industrielles, traduites dans le Plan national de développement 2021-2025 d'un montant de 90 milliards d'euros, dont 75%, à savoir environ 67 milliards d'euros, sont attendus du secteur privé national, régional et international. À travers ce PND, le gouvernement ivoirien travaille à la transformation des modes de production et de consommation en impactant significativement le taux de transformation locale de nos matières premières, notamment agricoles, créant ainsi plus de valeur ajoutée de nos matières premières, notamment agricoles, créant de la valeur ajoutée et des emplois durables. Ces produits manufacturés pourront faire, entre autres, l'objet d'échanges avec les autres pays africains. Je voudrais également saisir l'occasion de ce forum d'investissement pour féliciter et encourager l'ensemble des acteurs du secteur privé opérant en Côte d'Ivoire pour la confiance renouvelée à notre pays. La Côte d'Ivoire dispose aujourd'hui d'un marché de plus de 29 millions de consommateurs avec un compte des investissements simplifié, des avantages spécifiques pour la transformation de nos matières premières et des conditions très attractives d'accès au marché pour le développement de leurs affaires. Je voudrais rappeler qu'investir en Côte d'Ivoire, c'est avoir comme marché l'UEMOA et la CEDEAO avec plus de 350 millions de consommateurs à travers le tarif extérieur commun et l'Union africaine avec 1,3 milliard de consommateurs par le biais de la ZLECAf. Et indiquer également que la Côte d'Ivoire fait partie des pays qui ont mis en place un comité national de la ZLECAf pour faciliter les interactions entre le secteur privé et le secteur privé et public. Aujourd'hui, le défi pour nous est d'accroître le niveau des échanges avec l'Afrique, qui représente aujourd'hui, au titre du commerce intra-africain, environ 23%, au-dessus de la moyenne de 15%, de la moyenne africaine de 15%, et nos exportations intra-africaines sont de 23%, et au titre des importations, elles sont de 19%. Et avec la CEDEAO, qui représente environ 14,9% des échanges globaux de la Côte d'Ivoire avec l'extérieur en 2021. Les principaux pays clients de la Côte d'Ivoire au sein de la CEDEAO sont le Mali, avec environ 34%, le Burkina Faso 23% et le Ghana 12%, tandis que nos principaux pays importateurs au niveau de la CEDEAO sont le Nigeria avec 69%, le Ghana 12,3% et le Sénégal avec 12,2%. En vue de mieux soutenir les PME et également le secteur privé, l'État de Côte d'Ivoire a décidé de lancer une réforme en créant le guichet unique du développement des entreprises avec Côte d'Ivoire PME et la Société des garanties des PME, qui en réalité est un continuum qui permet d'accompagner les opérateurs économiques de l'amorçage jusqu'au financement. Et également pour booster, en fait, donner de la visibilité aux produits Made in Côte d'Ivoire, l'État de Côte d'Ivoire vient de créer son bras opérationnel au niveau international qui s'appelle Côte d'Ivoire Export, afin de faire connaître les produits manufacturés en Côte d'Ivoire. Distingués invités, notre continent a besoin de poursuivre ses investissements dans les domaines stratégiques pour renforcer ses capacités en matière d'infrastructures et d'énergie et rendre notre économie plus compétitive avec un secteur privé plus dynamique. C'est pourquoi je voudrais saisir l'occasion pour inviter le secteur privé africain à être plus audacieux et plus offensif pour tirer avantage des gisements d'opportunités offertes par notre continent. Je reste convaincu que le renforcement de la synergie d'action entre les États africains et les investisseurs privés permettra d'atteindre l'objectif de l'accroissement de la compétitivité de nos économies. Dans cette perspective, les gouvernements de nos pays se tiendront toujours aux côtés des investisseurs privés pour soutenir leurs efforts et les accompagner dans leur développement dans le cadre d'un partenariat gagnant-gagnant. Tout en réitérant mes remerciements à la Banque africaine de développement pour cette noble initiative, je voudrais clore mon propos en souhaitant plein succès aux travaux du panel sur le thème « Commerce et industrie, comment l'Afrique peut-elle être plus compétitive dans un contexte de mondialisation ?» Je vous remercie pour votre aimable attention. Merci.
Surely the minister deserves a bigger round of applause. Merci beaucoup, Excellence, and that marks the end of my French. Now, I'd like to introduce you to a very important man. I'll tell you what, I've attended very many sessions where this next speaker has been introduced as Banker of the Year, and the whole place is just bounced, it's broken out into applause because he's that popular amongst his peers and colleagues. Let's welcome, ladies and gentlemen, the President and Chairman of the Board of Directors of the African Export-Import Bank, Dr. Benedict Okey Oramah.
Thank you very much, Alan. His Excellency, dear brother, President Aki Adesina, President of the African Development Bank, the Secretary General of the AFCFTA Secretariat, dear brother Wamkele Mene, honorable ministers, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I'm highly honored by the opportunity to address this august gathering. Special thanks to the dynamic AIF coordinator, Ms. Chinelo Anohu, dear sister, and her team for constituting this panel and for a fantastic organization. Congratulations to my dear brother, President Adesina, for bringing back the physical Africa Investment Forum with a bank. We thank you for the privilege of being a partner to this great initiative. The recurrent global shocks currently unleashed by the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, the ongoing Ukraine crisis, and the intensification of geopolitical tensions are reshaping our world in a way not previously imagined. Although shocks have adverse ramifications for African economies, they can also serve as a springboard and present enormous opportunities for us to rethink, reimagine, and rewrite our story in a positive manner. For centuries, the African narrative has been littered by gloom and doom, written by others, unfortunately and regrettably amplified by us, and used as a basis to keep us in the periphery of global economic and trade activities. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, our story is far from gloom and doom. For instance, at the height of the pandemic downturn in 2020, the continent's average GDP contracted by only 1.6% against a world average of 3.3% contraction, with several of its economies recording positive growth rates during the period. Notwithstanding this performance, compared to the world and other regions, and observed resilience and robustness of economies, it is sad to note that over 56% of African countries rated by at least one of the major global rating agencies were downgraded, compared to 9.2% in Europe and 28% in Asia, where the pandemic was much more devastating. The effect of the inexplicable mass downgrades was to precipitate far-reaching economic crisis in African bond prices, economic crisis in Africa, as African bond prices crashed and made it difficult for most of, if not all, to access the international debt capital markets. Most ended up at the doors of the IMF with their heads bowed and unsure of how to manage mass anger at home. It appears that Africa is once again on the path to the dark days of the lost decade of the 1980s. Only that this time, it appears to be a victim of excessive trust on what it neither understands nor controls. As we work at providing an authentic narrative of the continent, trade and investment are important elements of Africa's growth story. Despite Africa's trade reaching about $1 trillion for low levels of less than $300 billion in the 1990s, the continent continues to account for less than 3% of global trade, remains still at the periphery. The low level of Africa's trade relative to the world is to a large extent attributed to the colonial legacy, where most African colonies were set up to produce raw materials to feed industries in the metropolis. It is no wonder that Africa's manufacturing value added languishes at slightly over 10%, whereas Asia saw theirs rise from slightly under 20% in the 1990s to over 70% today. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the challenge with Africa's trade is far from commodity dependence. It's far from loss of competitiveness. And today, we are having a debate, and I would like to provoke a debate. And that this panel is about to debate how Africa can be competitive in the global context. It gives me the opportunity to argue that competitiveness in the global context is a contrived notion intended to deceive those the world intends to leave behind. It is when we understand that this is the case that we Africans can double our efforts to take our destiny in our hands through the effective implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. It's only then that we will realize that it will be foolhardy for us to sit on our palms and expect some benefactor to emerge and help us to make the AFCFTA work. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the conventional wisdom today is that Asia, including China, got ahead of Africa because Asian markets were more competitive than Africa's in the 1980s and 1990s. Nothing can be further from the truth. Students of economic history will tell you that prior to the early 1980s, when the Latin America debt crisis hit the world, Africa was doing better than Asia, including China, in all key economic indicators. How could a continent which was doing so well become uncompetitive overnight? In my recent article titled Globalization and Recent Trade Wars, Linkages and Lessons, published in Wiley's Global Policy Journal in 2019, we argued that globalization in its purest form will require that all factors of production and goods be perfect substitutes everywhere and be allowed unfettered mobility within and across borders. In reality, in the implementation of globalization, movement of goods and capital was generally free, while movement of labor was severely restrained. So instead of cheap, unskilled labor migrating from labor-abundant developing countries to developed countries where extensive capacity for light manufacturing had been created, they were restrained. And knowing that goods produced in the labor-abundant economies could enter the developed markets, owners of capital moved their capital to the developing countries to create new light manufacturers for export to Europe, the USA, and the rest of the world. I argue that these investments went to Asia and Mexico for reasons other than better competitiveness at that time. For geopolitical reasons, the US and perhaps Europe wanted to create wealth in Asia, especially China. For national security reasons, it was important to the US that Mexico did well economically. I argue that Africa did not present enough geopolitical or security challenges to any of the major economies at that time for deliberate policies to be made to accelerate the inflow of FDIs to the manufacturing sector as happened in Asia. Your Excellencies, the world is changing. The 2020s is not the 1980s and 1990s. Globalization has created new powerhouses, and the world has become a more complex place. Nationalism and autarky are returning. It would be foolish for Africa to think that the rule of the game would be underpinned by the flawed notion of competition. The competition that matters is when you fall into the geopolitical equation that people notice. It's only by overcoming the colonial legacy of operating as 55 atomistic economies that we can earn a seat at the table and negotiate better terms for our trade and economic matters in bilateral negotiations that will become the new normal. It's only then that all the efforts we are making to improve our policies and attract investments can yield fruits. And don't get me wrong, changing policies to improve the way we invest, the way we trade is important. But it is not what determines where investments go, as I've argued. I hope that this perspective can find its way in the debate that will follow. I hope I've elicited that debate, and I thank you for your kind attention.
I'm looking forward to that debate as well. Let's give him another round of applause. Dr. Benedict Okey Oramah, President and Chairman of the Board of Directors of the African Export-Import Bank. Now, our next speaker is someone that I've known for a while and someone who is trade through and through. And I like to refer to him sometimes as a midwife because he's midwifing an African baby that is extremely important, and that African baby will determine where Africa goes next. Ladies and gentlemen, the Secretary General, African Continental Free Trade Area, Secretariat, let's welcome His Excellency Wamkele Mene.
Thank you very much, Program Director. In his absence, the President of African Development Bank, Dr. Adeshina, my senior brother, Dr. Benedict Okey Oramah, Minister Diarasuba, who welcomed us on behalf of the government, honorable ministers that are here, the director of the Africa Investment Forum at the AFDB. It is indeed a pleasure to be here this morning. And I want to start by also joining Professor Oramah to congratulate Dr. Adeshina for once again convening us at a time when the world is facing very, very severe challenges. I think the speech that Professor Oramah has just given, I want to congratulate him because indeed he did succeed to challenge us. He did succeed to provoke a debate. And I think that there are two events really that underscore the point that Professor Oramah makes, the underlying point that he makes, and that is COVID-19 and the geopolitical context that we find ourselves in, which is, of course, has a very adverse impact on Africa. And so the question today is, how does Africa respond to these rapidly shifting geopolitical contexts? How do we make sure that we improve our self-sufficiency as a continent? If there's a lesson to be learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, it is that over-reliance, Africa's over-reliance on global supply chains, on global commodities markets for export of unprocessed commodities, that of course, that over-reliance is a significant barrier to our self-sufficiency and economic development as a continent. If you think about it, in March 2020, the African continent received 7 million masks from a donation from an individual who is in China. And that is because at that time, our continent did not have the capacity to manufacture, let alone the vaccines, but the capacity to manufacture the tools that were required to fight the pandemic. At that time, and again, this underscores the point on the over-reliance, on global supply chains. At that time, there was a country in Africa that had only four ventilators for the entire nation. There were 42 countries out of 55 countries were either in full or partial lockdown, prohibiting the transit of goods that are required in countries where the supplies were very, very low. And so what all of this demonstrates is the need for the African continent to accelerate industrial development, that will enable Africa to establish truly regional value chains, rely less on global value chains, not disconnect, of course, from global value chains, but to rely less on global value chains for our own self-sufficiency. And I want to commend the African Union Commission, the leadership at that time, and Afreximbank for having stepped up to provide the support that was needed to enable the African continent to procure vaccines later in the year 2020, placing us on a path to this self-sufficiency, which is very, very important for the future of our continent. And so the African Continental Free Trade Area, because of COVID-19, took on a new sense of urgency and a new dimension to the importance of Africa's economic development. What COVID-19 underscored is that if we do not integrate this market of 1.3 billion people with a combined GDP of 3.4 trillion United States dollars, we shall forever remain fragmented, and we shall not be able to deal with any crisis that befall our continent. Furthermore, what it demonstrates is that if we don't accelerate implementation of the AfCFTA, we shall forever remain with smallness of national economies, the 42, 43 currencies that add to the cost of trade in Africa, and we shall forever remain exporters of primary commodities to the rest of the world. And so in the wisdom of the Assembly of Heads of States and Government, we now have the African Continental Free Trade Area, which has been ratified by 44 countries and is now in the mode of implementation. And in the implementation of the AfCFTA, we have the very, very strong support of both the African Development Bank and Afreximbank. Not only is the support political, but the support that we have received is also financial and in terms of resources. Implementation of the AfCFTA is going to be a difficult task. It is not going to be easy to integrate 55 countries that have historically, over the last 60 to 70 years, been fragmented in trade, investment, and rulemaking. And so we now have a comprehensive trade agreement that includes trade in goods, trade in services, intellectual property rights, competition policy, investment promotion and protection, digital trade, and a protocol on women and youth in trade. From the point of view of investment, the protocol on investment promotion and protection is intended to provide enhanced legal protections, not only for foreign investors, but for African investors when they invest intra-Africa. As I mentioned, the comprehensive nature of the AfCFTA is intended to capture the full spectrum of the African market. Over the next 20 to 30 years, we expect to see results of full market integration. We shall require tools to ensure that this agreement is effectively implemented. I will mention but a few of those tools. First, the AfCFTA Adjustment Fund, which we are working on with Afreximbank. And I'm grateful that Afreximbank has provided a seed capital amount of $1 billion to make sure that the AFCFTA Adjustment Fund takes off to the effective start which we all intend that it should. The AFCFTA Adjustment Fund is to provide support to countries that will experience short-term revenue losses as they reduce or eliminate tariffs over the next 10 years. It is not going to be intended for budget support, but intended for productive sector support in industries across countries that have ratified the AFCFTA. The second tool, which is equally important, is the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System. Again, with the support of the Afreximbank, we launched PAPS on the 13th of January this year in Ghana. 42 currencies, as I mentioned earlier. Cost of currency convertibility is estimated to be around $5 billion annually. That is $5 billion of jobs forgone, $5 billion of competitiveness in our regions forgone, and of course, the cost of doing business, the cost of cross-border trade for our small, medium enterprises and young entrepreneurs. And so the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System, we believe, is a tool that will enable access to trade, inclusivity, participation of small, medium enterprises, and of course, that will reduce the cost to trade in Africa. You will now be able to trade using your local currency, the Ghanaian cedi, trade with your counterparty in Kenya, who will receive the Kenyan shillings. The Pan-African Payments and Settlement System, as you may be aware, has been adopted by the Assembly of Heads of States and Government as one of the key tools, a critical tool for implementation of the AFCFTA. The third tool, which is equally important, and again we're working on this with Afreximbank, is the Intra-Africa Trade Fair, which will be hosted here in Abidjan, in Côte d'Ivoire, in November next year. And we're most grateful to the government of Côte d'Ivoire for offering to host the third edition of the Intra-Africa Trade Fair. The most recent trade fair, which took place in Durban, South Africa in November 2021, mobilized deals and transactions that were in excess of $32 billion. And we look forward to the Intra-Africa Trade Fair here in Abidjan to exceed that amount and to take advantage of the new market access that the AFCFTA shall open. The theme of this year's edition, building resilience through sustainable investments. I mentioned the challenge of COVID-19, which is also an opportunity for Africa. The other challenge is the situation between Russia and Ukraine. Many African countries are net importers of food. Many African countries import over 70% of grains from Russia, Ukraine, and yet our continent has over 60% of the world's arable land. We are a population of 1.3 billion people, in the words of President Paul Kagame, and yet we rely on a country of 43 million people to feed an entire continent. Therefore, the resilience that we're talking about must draw from existing capacities in Africa. The AFCFTA is intended to integrate and provide an anchor for these existing capacities on the African continent. Trading in basic agricultural products, which we do have, reducing and eliminating barriers to intra-Africa trade in agricultural products, tariff barriers as well as non-tariff barriers. All of these things, all of these objectives are enabled by the rules of the AFCFTA. I recently visited Zimbabwe. President Mnangagwa told me that Zimbabwe has $200 million worth of excess grains per year. That means that in 2 to 3 years' time, under the rules of the AfCFTA, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Zambia, Ethiopia, all of these countries have the capacity to feed Africa. Between all of these countries, the agricultural capacity has not yet been fully explored. And so we have to do more to mobilize investment in technology that will enable the storage and the processing of grains in Africa, that will enable Africa to produce her own food, that will enable Africa to ensure food security for its people, such that in 4 to 5 years' time, under the rules of AfCFTA, we can trade in basic agricultural products and not rely on countries outside of our continent for food sufficiency. The resilience, therefore, is potentially enabled by the rules of the AfCFTA, whether it is in agricultural products or indeed in the area of industrial goods or manufacturing. I want to conclude by mentioning the importance of manufacturing and how manufacturing and industrial capacity can enable the resilience that we all want to see in Africa. Our continent between South Africa and Morocco produces less than 1 million vehicles, 1 million units of vehicles per year. We are 17% of the world's population, and yet the entire continent produces less than 1 million units of vehicles per year. India, similarly populated to the African continent, produces close to 5 million units of vehicles per year. That means that India retains jobs in India. They import only the components that are required for the auto industry. Part of the strategy of the AfCFTA is to deploy the automotive sector industry as one of the drivers of industrialization on the African continent, and also as a significant driver of inclusivity in the benefits of the AfCFTA. We must work hard to make sure that outside of South Africa and Morocco, that we create opportunities for other countries to be part of the automotive sector value chain, to create jobs in their own countries, to create innovation in their own countries, contributing to a truly continental value chain. And in this regard, once again, I'm most grateful to Afreximbank for having provided an amount of $1 billion to support automotive sector industrialization through the AfCFTA. Not every country in Africa shall assemble and produce a vehicle, but through the studies that we have undertaken, there are opportunities for component sector which, based on our evidence, create more jobs than the actual assembly of a vehicle. For every unit of investment in manufacturing of a vehicle, there are 4 jobs that are created in the component sector. The processing of copper in Zambia, the processing of rubber into tires in Liberia, the processing of wiring harnesses in Botswana. All of these are opportunities for inclusivity of benefits of trade, opportunities to contribute to industrialization of our continent. And so I wish to end where I started, and that is that the resilience that we all want to see is the need for this resilience is underscored by these 2 crises, the geopolitical context as well as COVID-19. And so on the face of it, it may appear that these are debilitating crises, but actually, these are opportunities for the African continent to accelerate industrialization, to accelerate market integration, and to position our continent for greater economic prosperity in the next decades. Thank you very much for your attention.
Another round of applause for him. Lots of remarks there that need to be explored, and we are pressed for time, but we shall try to fit in as much as we can in the next 30 or so minutes. I'd like now, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce you to my panelists. I'll start by introducing Tadesse Admasus, who is the President and Chief Executive of TDB. Ms. Finn, please welcome, sir. Let's give him a round of applause. Rajakumari Jandiala, who is the CEO of Yatra Ventures. And I'd also like you to meet Mohan Vivekanandan, who is the Group Executive for Client Coverage and Origination at the Development Bank of South Africa, and Bernard Aite, who is the CEO of Bara Capital. Let's all welcome them as we get cracking. Thank you very much. Shall we again give the panel a round of applause? I like the formation. I'll explain that to you in a moment. But first of all, to get cracking, and please forgive me if I interrupt whatever point you're making so we can unpack it because of the pressure of time. But if I may start with you, Tadesse, just give me a sense of what you're working on at the moment. What are you most excited about, given what we've just had?
Good day, everybody, and thank you, Mr. Moderator. I think the one thing that comes to mind is really the reason why we all gathered around to create the AIF, which is really to focus on getting things done, right? Because I don't think we're short of analysis. Like many, I think I've read a lot of different reviews and reports and statements on the challenges and the size of the development financing gaps in different sectors. I think we're almost at a level of paralysis by analysis. And that's why when President Adesina talked about AIF focusing on business networking and deal processing and transactions and all of that, I said, finally, we have a conference that is less talk, more action. More prospecting to get things to move on the ground. And so in that regard, I think there's a lot to be said around the progress that's been made in recent years. I've been personally involved with TDB, of course, in some of these groundbreaking transformational projects that we saw at the opening of this conference. I think it was yesterday, and I was so pleased to look back on what we've achieved, whether it's the floating LNG project in Mozambique that's going to be very transformational to Mozambique, or the standard gauge railway in Tanzania, which is actually a clean transport project. It's electricity driven, not fossil fuel driven. And these are the kinds of mega transformational projects that we can look back in the past 3-4 years and say African institutions have put their weight behind these important projects. So we're getting things done, but clearly we're not doing anywhere near what needs to be done. There's always what is referred to as a type 1 error versus a type 2 error. A type 1 error is you get, the policies wrong, but you try to implement it and maybe you do it right. But the truth is we've known about diversification, we've known about industrialization, we've known about infrastructure, we've known about it for 50 years since independence.
Right.
So I also like to be provocative to say it's not for lack of knowledge that we have these challenges.
Let's get cracking. Let's do the things that need to be done.
We need to do serious diagnostics around why things are not happening.
Are you, for example, banks working together as Afri-Exim, FDB, TDB, sitting around the same table and doing deals together? Is that happening?
In this past 5 years, I can say confidently that we've been working so much more closely together than we ever have in our
Does that mean that there's room for improvement?
Well, definitely. I mean, we have one person on this panel who will speak soon, and that is one case in point where AFC and ourselves have rallied behind the project that this very bold entrepreneur has been trying to get off the ground. And 5 years ago, I wouldn't be able to point to any such project that we're trying to get involved in that is complex and requires upstream engagement and a little bit of risk-taking.
Yeah, but how easy is it for those collaborations for you to set aside your interests and tell Dr. Adeshina or Dr. Oramah that let's have a coffee and crack this deal? How easy is that at the moment, or are there things to be overcome? Because before we start talking about trade, you, the money guys, need to be collaborating, right?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I would probably be speaking for most of the institutions you've mentioned. The level of collaboration today, the level of co-financing, the confidence that there is, broadly speaking, is very high.
And when you go out there to people who are not Africans and you want to discuss these issues with them, do you collaborate in that effort as well? Is that easily achievable? Or is that something you're working on? I don't want to put you on the spot here. But,
well, it's a good question, because the truth is, there are so many other financial actors in Africa, and the Africans, of course, have a critical role to play, but we're not the only ones. And I think credit needs to be given where it's due. There's a number of European, particularly financial institutions, that we've been working very, very closely with. The Germans, the French, AFD, KfW Group, CDC, which is now BII. They've been very active, and we work very closely with all of them.
One of your guys, Tim Turner, talked at a panel that I was on, and he makes this point that there is a huge disconnect between perceived risk and real risk, and we'll come to that a bit later, because I find that very interesting as well. And Raj is a person that you are referring to, someone that you're working with on a project at the moment. Raj, tell us a little bit about that project that you're working on together with.
Thank you for having me today, and I just want to say this forum becomes more important each year that this is progressing. And so for me, at the end of the day, one of the things that people underestimate, I think, given the demographics perhaps, is we are dealing with public goods. Governments want investments, and they're dealing with how to deliver certain public goods can be financed by national budgets, and certain public goods, actually, they're so capital intensive, require foreign direct investment.
Yeah.
So in that regard, what we have done is to say to governments and saying, which of your value chains,
Let me just stop you there for a bit and just roll back a bit, because I need to get this to the back of my head. I'm very pedestrian, I'm a journalist, I'm not very clever about things like this. But you are undertaking a pretty big project.
Yes.
What project is it?
It's the East Africa Energy Security and Transition Project.
Okay.
It's based in Uganda,
Right.
but it is a commitment made by the East African community to deal with handling the issue of energy security, because they import 100% of their energy products, and that doesn't even meet 20% of their need to become so what I'm saying is there are aspirations these countries have, but the distance between the aspiration, relying on, somebody said, relying on global supply chains, one of the biggest risks to economic productivity is the inability to have energy security when you're importing 100% of your energy products, and that doesn't even meet your demand.
All right, so how then, so you are coming from a private sector position? You're in private sector, but you're managing to convince money guys to put money into your projects. What's that process like? Because it would be very interesting to learn from you what ought to be done, what boxes ought to be ticked in order to convince people to put all those millions of dollars into your projects.
Right, so we have two parts of the equation. One is to convince the public sector, the Ugandans, to pursue a capital markets approach rather than public sector debt borrowing. So the model itself, let's take you to the capital market, show that it's a commercially viable enterprise. So that took us an effort, and that's because as you know, public sectors are used to borrowing, and it's easy to control the contracts and move that forward. But there was a vision in East Africa that said, we need to diversify our financial model. So that was the first challenge,
right.
And we put that proposal in, and they were aware of their financial diversification objectives, and we participated. The second one was, whose perception of risk on this project should we start with?
That's interesting. So whose was more important?
For me, African financial institutions were critical, right? If I started in London or New York, I would have to explain sometimes where these countries are, how they're related, how there's economic integration already happening.
It comes back to Africa, doesn't it?
Absolutely. For me, my strategy was I showed up at the office of Admasu here, and I said, we're on this deal, we're going to need African financial institutions as partners. And TDB was our first partner.
Yeah.
The second partner I went to was the African Finance Corporation, which they're founders of the AIF as well. And I did the same pitch, saying, if we can put a group of African financial institutions together, then the perception of risk and commitment is shaped by the African institutions, as opposed to me trying to convince a risk perception. So I started with a set of financial institutions that are located on the continent, who had a perception with the risk and who understood the dynamics, and then said, we're in. Now that's kind of, so those
So, but when you have him on board, AFC becomes a much less complex conversation.
Yes.
And then that goes farther out.
And then we approached AFDB, and they have a facility called Africa Legal Support Facility, which we partnered
Which helps with the contracts and the negotiation.
Yeah, so we said our partner, the Ugandan government and the East Africans, we don't want to be mismatched in our lawyers, their lawyers, our advisors, their advisors. So we partnered with ALSF, we signed an agreement.
This is fantastic.
So it was basically building a quilt.
Yeah.
And then we went to the Milken Institute of Mike Milken out of Washington, and they said, look, every year we bring young professionals and senior officials from African central banks and African ministries of finance. We will deploy them to you to work on this project. So the whole fabric of this is driven by East African governments, African financial institutions, young professionals from central banks. And so for me, and then the US government was an advocate saying, this is what we're driving, capital markets.
So who's calling the shots at the moment? Is it you? Is it them? Is it the African institutions?
No.
Is it the Americans? They do tend to have a big voice.
It's a pure project finance.
Yeah.
And we have to establish commercial viability and profitability, which we've done.
I'll come back to you. Sorry, I'm not
No
rushing
worries.
the conversation. There's just so much to talk about.
No worries.
And I just want to now, just hear, from the point of view of someone else who has a lot of money to work with, is involved with lending infrastructure projects. You do have a lot of money, Mohan, do you not? You have a lot of money to play with. And by the way, if you have any infrastructure project, Mohan is the person to talk to. But when you listen to this conversation that's been happening, where do you fit into this equation?
Yeah, the topic really is around how do we promote trade and investment in the continent, take advantage of the opportunity that's been laid out for investments and for entities here based on the Continental Free Trade Agreement that the countries have come together. So now there's an opportunity for this $3 trillion market and for us to invest here. What we're trying to do is to ensure that the infrastructure is in place to promote that type of trade. Even though we're a South African entity, we operate throughout sub-Saharan Africa. We deploy typically about $1 billion per annum.
Where do you deploy it?
Well, the majority of it is within South Africa, about 2/3. The other third is throughout the continent. For instance, here in Côte d'Ivoire, we've supported the country with a number of the roads projects to improve the transport networks here. Similarly, we funded gas receiving terminals in Ghana. Admasu spoke about, for instance, the Central Corridor in Tanzania. We work closely with TDB Bank and a number of other financial institutions on that transaction as well. For us, I think we're looking at two elements that's needed. One is there is a lot of capital available, but not always risk capital, right? So there's a need to fund and to provide more risk capital, especially by African institutions. So
how do you correct that? How do you, when you say there's a need, how do you address that need?
Well, it's for us to step into that gap. So as an example, the DBSA traditionally provided long tenor debt for infrastructure. And we still do that, but what we've seen is, especially in supporting private investors, that's not enough because the commercial banks and institutional investors can actually provide that. What's needed is for us to have stepped in and work with them in the earliest stages, funding the feasibility studies, which we do, and then also providing them with and taking the equity portion of the capital structure, which then allows other investors to come in. And I think it also speaks to the comment that Raja made that if you have local investors coming in and taking the riskier portions, it'll then crowd in global investors much more easily. And the other is there's a lot of work that's needed to provide interconnectivity within the continent. Just connecting South Africa, for instance, through the North-South corridor, the Maputo corridor, the Walvish Bay corridor, those are all examples of critical investments that are made.
You know, that conversation has been happening for a very long time. I can tell you, it's been going on from the days of the Tazara rail and all these projects. What is the issue? Why has it not changed? Why in 2022 are we still talking about it?
Look, if I can speak about what is working, right? Within countries, there's a lot of investments that are happening within the infrastructure. We spoke about in Tanzania. In Namibia, for instance, we've recently concluded a $2.5 billion Namibian rand investment to improve the railways within Namibia. Similarly, we were part of a $600 million investment for a port in southern Angola, which is going to improve connectivity with the interior regions. Where I think we've failed, to be honest, is in projects that cut across multiple countries. So for instance, from South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, into the DRC, there the level of transport connectivity is still very poor. And it's really hard.
And we're not even going to talk about visas. I know that there's been an improvement, but there is an issue there that ought to be addressed. And the movement of labor, because I remember Dr. Oramah talked about that as well. And I'll come back to Raja in a moment to talk about productivity, because that is an issue that needs to be addressed as well. But now, I wonder though, Bernard, your wider point is there's a need to address, that this issue of Africa Free Trade Area is really mostly a business and industry issue. Is that right?
Yes.
Oh, Bernard, sorry.
No.
I'll come back to you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I totally agree with you, because from the political point of view, the regulatory point of view, the fiscal point of view, I think the African Free Trade Area is a very good response. What is the challenge now is to see whether the countries will, there won't be any mismatch between the political ambitions and the realities on the ground. On these topics, this is, as far as I'm concerned, the very big issues. Now,
could you just move your microphone a little bit so that we can hear you? Yeah.
So now we have said that, I think it's more we need to have an industrial approach to these topics, because trade flourishes when countries produces what their trading partners are eager to buy. So we need to be in a situation in Africa where we produce goods or provide services that our trading partners are ready to buy at a very fair price. So it's an issue and a topic of strategy. You need to have areas and regions in Africa focusing on their comparative advantages, so that in specific regions we will be focusing on specific products that will be able to move across the continent and being exported also.
But you see, that's a very easy thing to say in a place like this, but the practicalities of it are totally different, right? Because when you go to Uganda and you talk to President Museveni, he'll be dealing with a bunch of traders who are saying Kenyans will not take our milk. Kenyans will not take our eggs. Until recently, the trade minister for Kenya said, the chickens was told by Ugandan minister that the chickens are imported, the day-old chicks are imported from Kenya. And so for you to reject the eggs, you're really just rejecting eggs that have been laid by Kenyan chickens. But you see, the point I'm making though is there are all these irritating tiny little things that need to be overcome. Do you sense that there is a willingness to address those issues?
That's a very tricky question. At least when you listen to the political decision makers, there is a...
You believe them?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I believe them, but I believe what I see.
Right.
The thing is, there is a political will which is made by the policy makers. Now on the ground, we don't see these realities. That's why I was saying earlier, there is a mismatch between the political ambitions and the economic realities.
Yeah.
So when I don't know if you have the chance to travel across the continent by road, we are supposed sometimes to be in free trade areas, but people who do this traffic often knows the households they go through. So the repercussions of the political ambitions are not fully incorporated on the ground so far. This being said, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but we are already in the process of improving things, and I think the African Continental Free Trade Area is a response to that. Now we need to make sure that these policies are applied on the ground.
Tell me a bit about what Obara is doing across the continent. Obara Capital, your business. What do you do?
Yeah, what we do is that we consider that one of the constraints in the development of the continent is the ability to our private sector companies to export value-added manufactured and processed goods. So we provide them with tailor-made financial instruments that allow them to reduce the cost of funding, to optimize the cost of resources, so that they are in the position where they can better compete with the global peers.
Okay, so just give me an example of what you mean by that. So if I want to do something in Uganda, where I come from, how would you help me?
Yes, to take a concrete example, a couple of weeks ago, we have provided to a local cocoa exporter a 40 million euros facility to help them modernize to help them invest in their processing capacities and reduce the cost of funding.
40 million euro?
Yes.
And that's in Côte d'Ivoire?
That's in Côte d'Ivoire.
Where did that money come from?
That money comes from international banks.
Did it come from African institutions?
No. I mean, yes. It comes from international subsidiaries of African institutions.
Okay, so what's that interaction like? What's your dealings like with African institutions? Are they open to people like you and people like the client that you helped?
Yes, they are open to them, as long as you are able to provide them with the appropriate financial instruments that mitigate the perceived risks and the actual risks. So this is where we come over and we bring some sophistication in the way we can tailor-made instruments that meet the private banks' investment criteria and the realities of our clients.
Okay, so let me just come back to you to this. Just tell me a little bit about a situation like that. You have money, lots of money. They're looking for money. They want to put the money down. They're going elsewhere to find that money. Is it because it's cheaper to find that money elsewhere? Is it because it's harder to get money from organizations like yours? Is it a question of attitude to risk? What is it that needs to be addressed in a situation like that?
Well, you know, the truth is it's a marketplace, and when you're doing international trade, you can get trade finance solutions from an African service provider or a global service provider. It depends on relationships, it depends on business development, it depends on many different factors. It also depends on who is buying the cocoa from him on the other side. So, you know, there's so many variables, and I think the truth is somebody like him would have a lot of options.
Right.
Right, and I think it's fair to say that just because I'm an African bank, I shouldn't insist on him, you know, giving me the business, right? So if I never manage to get that business from him, you know, it's my loss, and maybe I should think twice about it next time. But yeah, I mean, I think the issue is not about individual entrepreneurs like this. I think his size of transaction is very bankable. That's something that can be solved by many different players, including banks in Europe and even in the US, perhaps, right? Because of the nature of what he's trading. I think the bigger problem is when you have the need to develop the underlying productive space, right? That's where it's a lot harder to get funding.
What do you mean?
Well, you know, industrialization. I think the Secretary General of the AFCFTA talked about the indispensability of industrialization to actually effect this trade between African countries, and even to just get us to move up the value chain with trade with the rest of the world. That requires investment, not short-term investment, it's medium to long-term investment in agro-industry, in mining beneficiation plants. It's bigger tickets, it's longer term, and it's more riskier.
Yeah.
Right? And the truth be told, that is really where we need to move the needle in the continent. And that's where institutions like DBSA, of course TDB, the long-term lenders really have an important role to play. And I think really the emergence of the AFC onto the landscape some 10 or so years back was very welcome, because they do quite a bit of equity.
Yeah.
Right? If you're a bank, you're a lender by and large.
Yeah.
Even though we've done a little bit of equity, when we're called upon to do so. We even do development capital, which is not normal debt. We have done it, and so does ADB. We all do a little bit of equity, but we're not designed to be major equity financiers. And this is the risk capital point that was raised earlier on, and I think this is where new institutions, new special purpose funds really become important in us getting to move the needle. Okay. And in that context, you asked earlier on, you know, do we work well with non-African partners? You know, the famous Turkana wind power project.
Yeah,
not
that's
everybody.
in Kenya.
No, exactly, the one in Kenya, 310 megawatts, the biggest wind farm in Africa. Today it's celebrated, everybody claps their hands, but not many people know how hard it was to get it off the ground. And one of the reasons was risk capital. There was a gap in the funding structure. A number of partners, including global partners, pulled out in a way that nobody expected. And the whole project was about to die. And if it wasn't for the African Development Bank, the European Investment Bank, and TDB, we came in and put in quasi-risk capital that actually helped plug the gap.
Yeah.
And that's the demonstration of how we can all come together and actually move projects. And we're hoping to be able to do that with some of these new projects that are coming up on energy security, where AFC has come to the party, not just providing debt when it's easy and bankable, but coming early in the process when it's riskier and harder to put development capital on the table. Yeah. AFC and TDB together have done that for this particular client, and it's not normal for us to do that, but we just felt we needed to help Uganda and the East Africa region get movement.
Raja, I'm going to come to you very briefly. We've run out of time. You can see these huge signs that say, get out of here.
No worries, no worries.
Productivity is a big issue. Yeah. There is this plan, there is this need, infrastructure, but there's the element of the quality of the human capital, because it needs to be sustainable, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big issues I think the head of the African Exim Bank and the Secretary General mentioned is about trade. And one of the issues of trade and goods and services is when we invest in this project for energy security, it's about 20 to 40,000 jobs over the course of this project. For example, we're looking for 10,000 welders to build this infrastructure, right? So we're encouraging governments, as part of the trade and infrastructure discussion, human capital has to be something that needs to be invested in, right? Without human capital and productivity, the issue about the scaling up of trade, East Africa has a free trade zone on its own. Before the African Greater Free Trade Act has taken place. So the movement of people, goods, and services has its own timing. But for me, when we're investing in infrastructure, human capital is a huge issue that needs to be taken into when you're talking about trade.
Right.
Because you're buying goods and services, right? You're buying services of human potential. So that productivity issue is sometimes perhaps underestimated in this equation, because we're looking at, have you built this? Have you put the right technology seems to take precedence sometimes. You know, I've got a new app, I've got a smart technology here.
But you do need a welder when it comes.
You need a guy to know how to weld this pipe from this pipe.
That's interesting.
And where are the schools that, if we need them in the next 14 months. So we're trying to encourage the region. It doesn't all have to come
Because the thing
from
about
Uganda.
welding, for example, is a skill that can be transferred very quickly, very
Everything.
easily.
It's
So if you're
engineering.
done with this project, you can move on to another
Yeah.
country
And
where
the
your services are needed.
And then the other issue is we have energy, we're going to be trading in energy products in the region. That's what we're producing. So we're saying is whatever infrastructure you're setting in that we're building, think about the software not from a technology point of view, but from a management point of view, from welders, people who will take over this investment.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's give Raja a round of applause. And Mohan, I just want you to spend the next 45 seconds just making that one point that you think has to be made, that one thing that you're sitting on that you're itching to say.
Yeah, I think I've got out the main points, which is, we do need more risk capital coming through on the equity side. I guess a reflection for me was, I was on a boardroom yesterday on a transaction. Funny enough, it actually started coming through our deal pipeline. But, what occurred to me was just, one, being able to listen to the sponsor and see him live made a huge difference. The other thing around why it was so easy was actually oversubscribed between us, AFDB, and a couple of the other funders, was the fact that they were sitting on a pool of equity capital coming from the US, and they had a lot of experience. They were able to do this development. It's a hospital project in Ethiopia.
Yeah.
So the fact that that equity was in place, and they had done all of the early stage work already, made it quite easy for us as lenders to actually come in. So the question is, how do we allow and create more of those types of facilities to get more of these projects going?
And to encourage trade across the nations of Africa. Finally, I'm going to ask you, Bernard, your final thoughts. You have about 14 seconds, literally, but I know you'll fit it in.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that if we manage to create an enabling environment, we will have the...
Could you just change your mic a little bit? Sorry.
If we manage to create the enabling environment through the APSCA, for instance, and other policies, we will have real investment opportunities in Africa. And if these investment opportunities manage to attract resources both from local financial institutions and international FIs, we will reach our goals to faster intra-African trade and also manage to reach a stage where we have a strong complementarity in terms of productions and local exports. Yeah.
Let's give my panel a round of applause. They truly deserve it. Absolutely brilliant. And Dr. Tedesse Admasus, President and Chief Executive Officer of TDB. And we also have Rajakumari Jandiala, who is the CEO Yatra Ventures. Mohan Vivekanandan, who is the Group Executive for Client Coverage and Origination at DBSA. And Bernard Aite, who is the CEO of Obara Capital. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for being such an attentive audience. My name is Alan Kasujja. My podcast is Africa Daily. I had to say that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.